And you all can turn to Matthew chapter 5. You should know that we've been in chapter 5 for like a year, it seems. Almost through with it. We're getting there. But it's good stuff, right? I mean, it's the Sermon on the Mount. This is, man, I mean, everybody always talks about it in such high regard, but really just working through it just takes it to a whole nother level. It's incredible when you really see what Jesus is saying and what he's doing here. We've been working through it. Jesus announced the arrival of his kingdom. That the kingdom of the heavens is at hand. It's here. The kingdom is here. What people had been longing for has arrived. Jesus has brought his kingdom. He said that it's available for everybody. Everybody can be in the kingdom. But he said there's some things about the kingdom that most people were misunderstanding. Namely, they thought that means that it was putting aside kind of everything God had been doing and just starting a brand new thing. And he said, no. We're not abolishing the law and the prophets. We're not getting rid of the old covenant and everything that was a part of it. We're fulfilling it, right? And that's different. That does mean some things won't be applicable in the same way, but we're not just scrapping it. God's not saying, well, plan A failed, let's go with plan B. No, this was the intention all along. That was just one step in the plan. And then he started to explain that in order to do that, in order to fulfill the law and the prophets, we have to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. And that's a tough task because they were very good at taking what it said and doing exactly that. No more, no less. They did it to a T. All 613 commands of the Old Testament, they were nailing it. And Jesus said, if your righteousness doesn't exceed theirs, you will never in any way, under any circumstance, make it to the kingdom of the heavens. So we've got to do better. And how can we do better when they did it all right? What they were doing was the wrong way of doing it. It's not about just fulfilling each and every specific command to the letter. Jesus has been explaining that to us, what it means to fulfill that, to exceed their righteousness. He talked about anger and contempt, and there really is kind of an order to what Jesus is doing. That's significant. Remember, Jesus was brilliant, wise teacher. He did things intentionally, including the order he addresses these things. Once you've dealt with anger and the contempt and the bitterness and things that would rise in your hearts towards other people, then you deal with the uncontrolled lusts and desires, especially sexually, that run and control us. He dealt with the divorce that inevitably results when you haven't dealt with anger and lust. Then he dealt with honesty, integrity, not needing to take an oath because your word is taken for what it is. And now he deals with a big R word, retaliation. Retaliation is huge. It's an all too common part of life. I mean, every one of us can think of a circumstance, probably recently, where something happened and we retaliated in some form or another. Whether we just said, I don't get mad, I get even. I'm going to get even, Or most often, it escalates. We have to one-up it. Well, if they did this to me, I'm going to get them back. But I'm not just going to get them back. I'm going to make sure they know not to do that to me ever again. I've got to make sure I get my point across. But then what happens? You one-upped them, and so they said, well, that's not fair because I only did this to you, so now I got to get them back. And I got to make sure they know not to one-up me again. And you see where that goes. It just keeps escalating, and it builds, and it builds, and it builds. Anybody ever had just a joyous celebration from the circle of retaliation? It doesn't end well. The path of retaliation destroys everyone and everything in its wake. That's just what it does. People continue to go down that road, and it doesn't stop. People don't know how to quit until it blows up and has become a disaster. So God, in his wisdom, gave us something in the law and the prophets called the lex talionis. That's the Latin term for the law of retaliation. Okay? It's in the Bible. It's in the Old Covenant. Do we know what that says? An eye for an eye, A tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. And sometimes we think that's harsh, but listen to the purpose, the intent of it. There were really kind of two things that law was doing. Number one, it prevented escalation. You cannot escalate. If somebody breaks your arm, when it goes to court because you've suffered personal injury, their arm would be broken. And that's it. There is no, well, he broke my arm, so I'm going to break both of his. No, only one. They break your leg, their leg gets broke. Not both. There's a limit. It caps it. And that's a beautiful thing. It prevents things from getting out of hand. And this law of retaliation was really an incredible thing compared to other stuff going on in that day. It was wonderful. But the second thing it did was it also ensured justice. Because sometimes, if they broke my arm, but they're kind of a high-standing person with some, backing behind their name in the community, well, we're not going to break their arm. Maybe we'll break their pinky. They had something done to them, but it wasn't the same. No. They broke the arm. Their arm gets broke. So they can't do more, but they can't do less. And so it takes the personal element. It takes out the corrupt factors of justice and brings a stabilization. There's an equalization across the board. Whatever you did, that will be done to you. Not less than that, but not more than that. And in some ways, that's a beautiful thing. It really is. That's a good law. But is that what Jesus is saying we should do? In fact, by Jesus' day, nobody was doing that anymore anyway. Most things, pretty much all retaliation was settled financially. You inflict a personal injury, you get taken to court for X amount of money in compensation. That's just the way that it was. And by then, nobody was actually breaking an arm or knocking out a tooth for a tooth or anything like that. And the Jews, they couldn't even carry out the death penalty themselves to take a life for a life anyway. So it was all financial, but listen to what Jesus has to say about how retaliation shouldn't work in the kingdom. Would you stand, please, as we read God's word? You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. You may be seated. Jesus just turned that whole thing upside down, which is what Jesus tends to do with everything. He takes what we think we know, what we think we understand, and he completely flips it all upside down. But the upside down, inside out world of the kingdom is actually the right side up and right side out that God always intended for humanity to live. It just doesn't make sense with the way that we've become because of our sinfulness and hardness of heart. But his kingdom is going to look like he intended it to look like. But what is Jesus doing? Is he saying just scrap the law of retaliation and don't do any retaliating at all? Completely, period. Is Jesus demanding pure pacifism on the part of his people? Because that's how many take it. That's how this has been interpreted often throughout church and world history. Is that what Jesus is saying? Well, somebody said it. It's a 2-letter word that starts with an N. No. That's not what Jesus is saying. Because is Jesus giving us a new set of stricter laws? No. Is Jesus giving us something that we need to slavishly obey the letter of it? No, because who did that? The Pharisees. And do we need their righteousness? No, we need a righteousness that exceeds theirs. We need to go above and beyond that, and that doesn't mean keep it more strictly because they kept it. You can only keep the law, and if you've kept it, you've kept it. You can't keep it more than those who do it already. He's leading us the way beyond the Pharisees. He's showing us the true intent. The law of retaliation wasn't meant to do what it was doing. It was always pointing to something more, something deeper. Just like the command to not murder didn't mean as long as you stop short of murder, you're good, right? It intended something deeper. Deal with the anger in your heart. Well, this law of retaliation isn't saying make sure you retaliate properly. It's really saying, why don't you check your heart and see why you're retaliating to begin with? You've got to deal with your heart and what's driving it. Jesus is not saying that we can never respond to aggression. He's not saying that. And we have to keep in mind, this is about personal injury being suffered, and he's ultimately dealing with not justifying yourself and getting personal revenge against other people. If somebody else is being beaten or abused, we need to intervene. Okay, this is not telling the abused wife, just keep letting him beat you because you're turning the other cheek. No, that is not what Jesus is saying. You need to tell somebody and you need to call the police, okay? Jesus is not saying you just need to subject yourself to terrible abuse. That's not what Jesus is saying. And we know that because that's not how Jesus did any of these other things. Remember, this more than anywhere else in the Sermon on the Mount, we have to understand what Jesus is doing and what he's not doing. We really, truly have to clarify our understanding of what Jesus is saying. Because so often we run into this and say, well, Jesus said you have to turn the other cheek. And if I don't, then I feel guilty. I feel like I've disobeyed God and I've done something wrong. But the circumstances will dictate a lot of these things. In fact, Jesus just said in the last passage to never take an oath, right? Well, did you know that in Jesus' trial, when he was arrested, he testified under oath? The high priest actually said in the middle of the proceeding, this wasn't like a preliminary thing that you're just under oath for all of it. He stopped what was going on and he said, I adjure you by the living God. In other words, Jesus, swear to God right now, are you the Son of God? Jesus said, I am. And you'll see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. He gave his testimony under oath on the spot. Boom, didn't hesitate. Didn't say, wait a minute. I'm not going to say that under oath, but I want you to take my word. I am. He didn't do that. He didn't. Honestly, I went and got a passport the other day. I had to swear that everything on there was telling the truth. And I thought about this. But that's not the issue. Right? That's not the issue. And then Jesus, this whole turn the other cheek. Jesus gets slapped in the face during his trial. Do you know what Jesus did when they slapped him in the face during the trial for his response to the high priest? What did Jesus do? Did he turn the other cheek? No. He protested. He said, if what I've said was wrong, testify to the wrong. But if it wasn't, why do you strike me contrary to the law? So was Jesus a hypocrite? He said, turn the other cheek, but he didn't turn the other cheek. Well, no, because he wasn't saying everybody has to turn the cheek every time or else you're sinning in evil. He's giving us a picture of what the heart of somebody normally looks like in the kingdom. Now, there will be exceptions, and they should be exceptional, right? Don't get wronged and say, well, pastor said that Jesus didn't really say that, so I'm justified in defending myself. No, we're not going to take this too far. But we don't want to take it too far in either direction. We need to understand what Jesus is saying. And to make this a strict list of do's and don'ts is to misunderstand Jesus and his heart. What he's saying is that we should be humble and selfless. And that we should always prefer to operate out of love rather than vengeance. When we are wronged, what is our driving force of our response? Is it to get even? Is it to make them pay for what they've done? Or is it to respond in love and kindness and appropriateness? Jesus didn't hit the other person back. And he was beaten and abused in many other times that he did just continue to let it go down. So we have to wrestle with it. He's not giving us a clear-cut thing. See, that's all the Pharisees could do is, well, if there's a rule, I can follow it. That's really a cop-out. That's a cheap, easy way out of responsibility and maturity and leaning into the Holy Spirit for guidance and understanding and wisdom for each situation to be understood for what it is. And that's what Jesus is calling us to here. Our natural instincts should not be to get even. It shouldn't be to get back. It shouldn't be to make them pay for what they've done to me. It should be humble and selfless. Our first instinct, our natural response, our default should be to overcome evil with good. It should be to overcome hate with love. And that's how it really does work. It really does. And that's why, in certain ways, people in the kingdom, what's the one thing you always hear when people start talking about the Sermon on the Mount, and especially when they get to this part on retaliation? So what, are we just supposed to be a doormat? Was Jesus a doormat? No, Jesus was no doormat. Did he let people strike him? He did. Did he let people rip out his beard? He did. Did he let them crucify him and take his life? He did. He could have prevented all of it. And he reminded him at one point, he told Pilate, don't you think I could get 12 legions of angels just to deal with this? But I'm not. But what happens is when you live the kingdom life, it disarms the hate. It disarms the evil. Because when the bully hits you and you just kind of turn the other cheek and let him hit you again, you don't run away, you don't cower, you just take it and say, I still love you. I'm still going to pray for you. It messes with people. It really does. There are countless stories of martyrs, people who've been martyred, they actually lost their life, but they died so well, loving even their persecutor, that persecutor was messed up. Messed up, and ended up turning their heart to the Lord because of how they saw this person die. It changes people. And often, that's an extreme case, but there's plenty of it. But most of us are never going to be there. But when you live a kingdom way, it brings the kingdom to bear in the situation. It unleashes the resources and power and love of the kingdom of the heavens right into your situation here and now. You don't have to worry about being a doormat because you don't care about being a doormat anyway. You're not concerned about what other people think of you. You're concerned about showing the love of God to everyone, even those that are wronging you. That is the heart that Jesus is trying to show us, that those in his kingdom should operate on a whole different paradigm of life when it comes to retaliating for being wronged personally. Remember, this is about personally being wronged. This isn't, somebody's abusing somebody. This isn't, you're not defending, if your little brother or sister is getting bullied, take them out, right? Jimmy, you just need to turn the other cheek. No, stand up for your brother. Do that. That's what Jesus would do. That's what Jesus is going to do. All the people that are abusing us and mistreating us and persecuting his people, bad things are going to happen to them. God is going to bring justice. Okay? He doesn't let evil run rampant, and neither should we. But we're always motivated by love of God and love of other people, including those that are wronging us. So what do we do with that? Strengthen your resolve. Determine you're going to become that kind of person. You have to want to. You have to want to be willing to set aside your rights. And there is a matter of setting aside your rights in this situation. Jesus gave 4 different examples of what it was like in kingdom retaliation. He gave 4 examples. One was to turn the other cheek. We saw that. But he also said, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, you go 2. And that was something that was against the law. The Roman soldiers could demand anybody to help them and carry something them for up to 1 mile. Usually it was because they needed something moved, so they would just grab someone and say, hey, you carry this with me. We've got to go. And most people would grudgingly do it, they would probably kick and fight until they got threatened and put in their place. And then they would carry it for a mile and drop it and say, not a step further, and there's nothing you can do about it. And it was true. There was nothing they could do about it. But imagine if that person said, oh, sure, absolutely, I'll take it with you. Get to the mile, and they keep walking and say, no, I'm going to take it another mile because I don't have anything else going on today, so I'm just going to be a blessing to you because I know you have this need, and I want to help. What do you think that soldier is going to do? He's going to be shocked. Like, are you okay? We need to call a physician? What if my commanding officer finds out that I let this person carry that 2 miles? But no, stop. Not worth my life for you going an extra mile. It changes people. But are you going to be willing to be that kind of person who does something that is even illegal for somebody to do to you, you let it happen? When he said if they take your shirt, and it's talking about court, if somebody sues you and takes your shirt in pledge, because that was what they did then, he said give them your cloak also. Now, did you know it was against the law to take somebody's cloak, their outer garment? That was against the law because they needed that. That was, in some cases, the only warming layer they had. They would sleep on it or use it to wrap up in at night. And the law specifically states if you take their cloak in pledge, you have to give it to them before night. They need to be able to have it. You couldn't keep it. But Jesus says, even though you have the right for nobody to ever take your cloak from you, if they're suing for your shirt, maybe they have a need. Why don't you just be generous and say, here, I care about your needs. Even though you're suing me, I care about your needs, and I want to make sure you're taken care of. And do something that nobody has the right to do to you. Are you willing to set aside your rights, your pride? All the things, well, nobody's going to do that to me, get away with it. That is one of the most arrogant, prideful things we could ever think, let alone say and then act on. Do you want to positively engage your aggressor rather than negatively respond? Because you have to settle it right here with your want to. You have to want to become that kind of person. That's not easy, but that's where it starts. And are you willing to do whatever's necessary to make that happen? See, that's really a bare bones definition of a disciple, a follower of Jesus, somebody who will do what Jesus asks no matter the personal cost. If Jesus is displaying this kind of heart, am I willing to develop that kind of heart within me no matter what it costs me personally? That's a follower of Jesus. Will you set aside your pride when you're embarrassed or humiliated? We've all had times that we've been embarrassed. How do we respond to that? I mean, imagine you're in a restaurant and somebody knocks your drink all over you. Are you quick to jump up and say, are you an idiot? Why don't you watch where you're going? That's not real godly. That's not the kingdom being displayed. No. Especially if it's the waiter or waitress. You know, one of the first things that runs through your mind is, well, there went their tip. If you don't give them a subtle little attitude and digs throughout the rest of the meal. But what we should do is comfort them as best we possibly can. Tip them double what you normally did because they're already feeling crummy enough. Even if you feel like they did it on purpose. Double your tip. Express your appreciation and your understanding. Because that's what kingdom people do. That's what Jesus would do. Jesus would, usually if you're getting bad service, it's because they're having a bad day, and you should love them and engage them and see if you can pray for them. And then tip them big. Notice it always ends there. You should always tip big. Be generous. Don't let it be based on your service. Let it be based on your heart. How about that? Are you willing to give up your rights when they're warranted? See, we're big. I've got rights. We need to drop that line of thinking. That's not kingdom. That's United States thinking. That's not kingdom thinking. The kingdom of the heavens says, I have the right to be a child of God, and I have the right to love everyone else even when it hurts me. I have the right to refuse my rights if it's going to show love and kindness to somebody else. That's the way the kingdom of the heavens operates. That's the way Jesus operated. But are we willing to give up our rights? We're so big on holding them. Are we willing to set them aside and say, I have the right to that, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to love them. Or I'm going to let them wrong me. Paul said in Corinthians, when he was talking about lawsuits with believers, he said, why not rather be wronged? Like, why take them to court and sue them? Just take the wrong. That's a kingdom mindset. That's what Jesus did. But you have to want this way of life. You have to want to be willing to love others when everyone thinks you're a nut for doing it. You're crazy. How could you respond that way? You don't have to take everything Jesus says to the extreme. No, but I do have to love people. Right? I need to respond differently than the world. If everybody in the world says the way you're responding makes sense, that's probably not a kingdom way of responding. It probably isn't. But you've got to determine that you're going to overcome evil with good. You've got to determine that you're going to overcome hate with love. You've got to determine that you're not going to respond the way that the world teaches you to respond. You're going to respond the way Jesus responds and the way Jesus would respond if he were you at the moment in that situation. You've got to determine that you can and will run as far away from retaliation as you can and not just embrace it at the first moment. So how do we do that? We got to develop our hearts. You're never just going to find yourself in a situation and respond differently than you used to because you thought about it that time. That's not the way it works. We have ingrained habits. We have muscle memory. We have things that we do naturally by default. We have instincts. But those things can be changed. That's part of becoming a different person, having a different heart, developing your heart, being shaped in the image of God. And it's not something you have to wait until you die and go to heaven. Jesus didn't die just for you to have your sin forgiven so you can go to heaven. Jesus died so that you could be welcomed into his family and be one of his people the way humans were created to be. And that starts now. His death was not so impotent that it couldn't change our life now. His death and resurrection was powerful, and it allows us to live differently. So we saw it already, and we're going to mention it again. 1 Timothy 4:7, train yourself in godliness. You might think, Pastor, you keep mentioning these same verses. Yes, I know, and I'm going to keep mentioning them because we need to be continuously reminded of these things. Repetition is what helps make it sink deep. Train yourself for godliness. But know that it's not just you. Remember Paul. For this I toil, struggling with all of his energy that he powerfully works in me. Paul is toiling, Paul is struggling, but it's God's power being worked in him. It's a partnership. It's a together thing with you and God, but you can't just sit around and say, well, God, I'm just waiting for you to change my heart, because you'll be waiting until you do die and go to heaven. And you'll never be different. And you'll just be a churchgoer that went to church your whole life and never became Christ-like. And there's too much of that in our world. There are too many church people that have been going to church, but they're not following Jesus and they're not becoming like Jesus. We weren't called to go to church. We were called to follow him. So create a game plan to shape your responses in love rather than vengeance. Be intentional that when you're wronged, when your pride is tugged on, when something happens, you're going to respond in love, not aggression. And write out your game plan. I'm going to do these 4 things. If this is an area where you really struggle, that you're quick to respond in anger and aggression when somebody does something to you, purpose to deal with this thing, because you can change and it can eventually not be your struggle. We all have certain hangups, but that doesn't have to be your hangup forever. You actually can grow and see victory in your hangups. But you have to want to, and then you have to do something about it. So here's some suggestions as always. What's step 1? Pray about it. You can't do anything else until you've prayed about it. Drives me nuts when people say, well, all we can do now is pray. Well, what in the world have you been doing? You shouldn't do anything else unless you've started with prayer. So if you're thinking, well, prayer is our last resort, like it's some, oh no, we've tried everything that we thought would really work, now we'll pray. You should have been praying all along, and you probably wouldn't be in the situation you're in. And it's not that prayer works, because prayer isn't the thing. God is the thing. God works, and we approach him in prayer. Pray about it. Pray specifically, because we do need his strength. We do need his grace. We can't do it on our own. But he's promised to respond when we seek him. Pray for humility when situations escalate and you're insulted. Because you know when you get embarrassed, you feel insulted, your first thing is to want to rise up and put them in their place, because they just did that to you. And nobody does that to me and gets away with it. When you feel insulted, you need to pray for God to give you humility, because that's just pride. All it is pride that says they're not going to treat me that way. They're not going to make me look like a fool. All pride. Pride, pride, pride. Pray for humility. And you're not going to be able to stop in the moment, probably most times, and just pray for humility then. You need to have been praying for humility. If you know that's you, every day, God, if I run into a situation today, please give me humility to not respond the way I normally do. That's got to be regular praying for God to change your heart. Pray for peace when you feel your temper rise. Okay? You've been there. Something goes down, you're insulted, or somebody did something to you, they took advantage of you, they wronged you, maybe they did physically hurt you, and you know how it gets, your stomach starts to get a little bit of knots. Okay, you feel your blood pressure start to rise a little bit, you feel your face start to get a little flush, your hands start to get a little sweaty, your muscles start to tense up. We've all been there. We've all had those moments. Yes, I've had those moments. Okay, human. We're all human. We deal with these things. But you know what you do? You pray, God, I know I struggle with that. Will you give me peace in those moments? A peace that overcomes my mind, a peace that overcomes my body, and allows me to rest and trust you to take care of it. But you've got to be praying ahead of time. You're not going to be able to just stop in the moment all of a sudden and accomplish this thing. You've got to be more wise than that. Scripture says we're aware of the devil's schemes, so we've got to be making plans. Secondly, meditate on Scripture. The two we're going to look at today is 1 Peter 2. Write this down. If this one resonates, let this be the one that you memorize and meditate, and you spend at least 5 to 10 minutes a day for 6 to 8 weeks. Okay? 5 to 10 minutes a day, 6 to 8 weeks. There has to be repetition and longevity for these things to really penetrate our heart and our mind and impact the way we think and the way that we respond. He says, this is a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Okay, all of this is unjust. For to this you have been called. So you want to know what God's called you to? Yeah. This is God's calling on your life as one of his followers. Don't run from that. Embrace it. Because Christ has also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When somebody says, you're a stupid idiot because of your political views, you don't respond. You don't get into that. You live above that. You're living in the kingdom. We're not going to get concerned with trifling things like the politics of any particular nation. Who cares? The kingdom is operating on its own program. Nothing to do with it. When you're reviled, you don't revile in return. When Jesus suffered, he didn't threaten them. Just so you know, I'll turn my other cheek, but I've only got 2 of them. And then you're going to get it. No, he didn't threaten. If Jesus was just being purely legalistic, yes, you could turn the other cheek and then have your way. That's not what Jesus was saying. He didn't threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He said, I don't need to respond because the Father's got it. You don't even have to worry about it. Father's got it. Romans 12. Paul says, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. You hear that? Give thought to what you do. Think before you act. Don't just respond. Give thought to what you do, to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. If this is an area that you really struggle with, pick one of these passages. It doesn't have to be, just pick one or find some other one and just work on that, meditate that, pray that daily until you see God making changes in your heart. Because once your heart changes and you begin to think differently, your actions will follow naturally. But it has to start in your heart. Thirdly, other disciplines, fasting, by all means, fast as a regular part of your walk with Jesus. If you're a journaler, write these things down. Talk about how you retaliated to a certain person and make note that you're not going to do that again, that you're going to grow in this. You got to write it down. Or here's a good one that's going to be probably the most challenging. But in those situations, make it a habit to ask Jesus how you should respond. Somebody bumps you and knocks all your food over. Jesus, how should I respond to this? Because I guarantee you, if you do that, you're not going to say, hey, what the heck is wrong with you? Because that's probably not what Jesus would do. And that's probably not what Jesus is going to say you ought to do. But if you could develop that habit of, in the moment, Jesus, how should I respond to this? It'll change things. And it'll change them in a very, very good way to where your life reflects the kingdom more and more and more. And then fourth, get somebody involved. We're created as a body to do things together. Paul, in one of his analogies, says that the hand can't say to the foot, I don't need you. The hand can do a lot of things, but without a foot, how's it going to get there to do it? The eye can't say to the feet, look, I can see everything and you can't see anything, so I don't need you. Or else the eye is just going to be sitting there, never getting anywhere to see anything other than what's already in its field of vision. We can't look at our brothers and sisters and say, I don't need you, me and Jesus, we got this. I'm dealing with my anger, stay out of my business. That's a good way to struggle with anger for the rest of your life. We need each other. Be willing to ask for prayer. Be willing to let somebody in to see your heart, to pray with you, to love you, to encourage you. We've got to do it together. So, don't give in to the impulse to get even. Don't give in to the impulse to one up. Don't give in to the impulse to make them want to pay for what they did. Entrust yourself to the Father who judges justly. He'll take care of it all. He will take care of it because that's what happens in the kingdom. You've got to run from retaliation and do everything that you do operating on a different plane in the kingdom. Operate on the plane of love for God and for others, including those who would wrong us and harm us personally. That's what Jesus did, and he's called us to follow him in his kingdom ways. Lord Jesus, we thank you that you've taught us these things, and I thank you that you are showing us clearly what you meant and what you didn't mean. And I pray that we're able to understand that, not just from a mental standpoint, but truly from our practical living, that we should be turning the other cheek. We should be refusing to justify and defend ourselves when we've been wrong. But that doesn't mean there's never a time that we do need to stand up for what is right and honor you in the way that we do that. May you fill us with your Spirit, Lord. Give us wisdom. We need wisdom. And we need your love working in our hearts to show us how to respond in each and every situation, that we could glorify you and show that the kingdom really is at hand and working in the midst of us. May you be glorified in us and through us as we make your name known to this world through everything we say and do. Amen.